doing an introduction, and then today you guys get to preach to yourself. How about that? Don't worry, I'll give you sermon aids. It's okay. All right? Today we're talking about assess yourself. Those of you who know me well know a couple of things about me. I love studying people and teams who are successful, and my favorite sport is football. All right? And so when you kind of put those two together, what I really, really love is studying successful football players and successful football teams and how they become successful and what they do and that kind of thing. And it's amazing how much work goes in before the players ever hit the field and get on the turf and play the game. There's so much planning that goes on ahead of time. And what I want to look at first of all is this. It's easy to look. Us, armchair referees, right? It's easy to look and say, oh, I would have done this, I would have done that, I would have done the other thing. You should have called that play. Why did you run it up the middle, third and long? That's crazy. Yeah. And so it's easy to do that, and yet there's just this plethora of coaches that are up there making decisions on the spur of the moment. There's the players that have practiced this kind of thing. But one of the most interesting things I've learned over time is this. One of the things that helps people the most. Not quite ready for that.
Oh.
Okay. I'll give you a cue in just a minute. But thank you. Got eager ushers here. is the film room? What goes on in the film room? And the film room is used basically for two things. One, you study your upcoming opponent's tendencies in the film room. You look at game film from their previous games, and you try to find a weakness that you can exploit. Where are the one-on-one matchups? Where are they weak? Are they weak in the defensive back? Okay, we're going to run these certain plays that exploit that weakness. On their offense, where are they best? And how can we stop that pass of that really good quarterback or that run of that really good running back? How are we going to handle this certain play? And then also in the film room, what you do is you review yourself from the last time you played. And I imagine that's got to be the emotionally toughest part, because these players who are high-performance people, they love to win, they love to compete, they love to get out there and be the best they can be, and they know they're in competition with everybody else out there. And then they have to look at this mistake. And coaches don't just show that mistake one time in the film room and say, okay, you messed up here. No. They got these things where they can fast forward it, rewind it, slow it down, and rewind it, and run it, and look at the same play maybe 11 different times. One looking at each player on the field on the other team and how they reacted, or each player on your own team and how they reacted, that made that play break down or helped that play be successful. And so that is a kind of self-assessment that I think every one of us need in our spiritual life. Now, we don't need someone walking around all day with us, following us around with a camera, a whole camera crew, right? Doing all this and saying where we messed up. Uh-oh, you let a bad word slip out right there. Oh, watch that attitude right there. Uh-oh, this is where it broke down. That kind of thing. And yet, I think, hopefully, we all have enough self-awareness that we can look at our life, and if someone says, okay, well, what about this? How are you doing in this area? I hope that we have the kind of hearts that would honestly look and say, pretty good, but I could do better. Or, yeah, that's one thing I've kind of got, not 100%, but I got it almost mastered here. And this other thing, well, I'm not even really up and running on this. All right? So this morning, what I'd like to do is a self-assessment. And I'm going to give you a tool. Now, before we hand it out, I need to make a couple of disclaimers. Number one, this is not a test. It's an assessment. Okay, there's a difference, because you know what you can do with a test that you can't do with an assessment? You can fail it. Okay? You can fail a test. An assessment is just a snapshot in time of where you are, and we're all on this journey, hopefully going to the same direction, to be like Jesus, bearing fruit for Him, living our lives for Him, and we have different strengths and different weaknesses. Here's something else it's not. It's not a spiritual gifts assessment. Okay? Pretty much all of you have gone through a spiritual gifts assessment where you've checked off these different things, and yeah, I strongly agree, strongly disagree, or somewhere in the middle, and then we kind of tally up the scores and associate them to different gifts, and you find out what your strongest gifts are, and then you're encouraged to lean into those, into your work with the church. Find a ministry that lines up with your spiritual gifts. And I think you guys have done a really good job with that. We've got a lot of people serving in areas that God has gifted them, where they're talented or skilled or experienced or just supernaturally gifted. And you're serving in those ways. And it makes the church run so much better corporately when every individual is doing that. Okay? This is not a spiritual gift assessment. So it's not a test. It's not a spiritual gift assessment. It's really more of a spiritual growth assessment. It's where you are on your growth curve. Now, some of you are newer Christians or less experienced with church, and I don't want you to feel guilty that you're not knocking it out in this area or that area or the other area. This is only to become aware of some things that God would want you to do and would help, and you would want to grow in to be able to bear more fruit. Now, the other thing, if you know me well, or if you've heard very many of my messages, is this. I'm really big on upward, inward, and outward. Okay? And I'm going to tell you one of the reasons why I'm big on upward, inward, and outward today, and that is this. I have a firm conviction that the Christian life is neither complete nor balanced if we're not growing in all three. And it's so easy. It's like a habit, right? Habits can help you or habits can hurt you. There are good habits, there are bad habits. And then there are also some deceptively bad habits that are good things we're in the habit of doing, but they're bad for us in that they don't stretch us. They don't help us grow. And we're creatures of habit, every one of us. Just being a human being means you're a creature of habit, right? If we find something that works for us, and nobody complained, and it seemed okay for us, and we got through, at the end of the day, it worked, we'll have a tendency to do that tomorrow. And then we'll have a tendency to do that the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Until finally we're in such a habit we don't think about it. And although it may be a good thing we're doing, it also holds us back because it's not stretching us. Every one of us needs to be stretched. And God is so creative, right? I mean, He has so many ways to stretch us, right? He wants us to grow. And when you're feeling stretched, when you're feeling like, wow, this part of life is hard. This part of life, I feel like a baby just trying to walk here. That could be God stretching you. Or something you've been good at in the past, but a new dimension kind of enters that, and it's something that you're like, okay, well, I've always done it this way, and it's worked, and it's stretched, and it's helped me grow, but not in this circumstance. Boy, this is different. Wow, God, what are you doing now? He's stretching you in something you're already good in to make you better. Jesus talked about in John 15 how fruitful branches even get pruned, right? It's not just the branches that detach from the vine that aren't fruitful. Even the ones that are fruitful, God wants them to be more fruitful. And if you know anything about gardening or trees or flowers or anything, sometimes you have to prune something back a little bit to make it more fruitful in the long run. And it makes it more beautiful. And it blooms better and has more fruit. So sometimes we find ourselves in habits that are familiar to us, but we even get stretched within those. All right? So, without further ado, I'm going to ask a couple of our ushers here to come up and give everyone a sheet of paper. It's double-sided, so you'll notice a little bit of color coding, one for upward, one for inward, one for outward. And then also on the back, there's a red one, because this is when you put it all together. Does it lead to a life that looks like Christ? And does it lead to a life that is managed well? Remember our life management series from a couple of months ago. We want to manage. Also, if you need a pen, just raise your hand, and they'll give you a pen while you're at it. All right, so this is, again, not a test. Can't pass or fail. It might, expose an area you need to grow in, or it might affirm an area that you're doing well in, and that's good. All I ask is that you be honest. The only wrong answer is a dishonest answer. All right? Now, with any assessment, you also have to make one more disclaimer, and that is, don't overthink every question.
Oh.
I know. For those of you who like overthinking and you're good at it, and that's your habit, I'm going to ask you to show some restraint here. Probably the best way to do this is just read the statement, and then can I quickly come up with 2 or 3 examples that are consistent in my life? If I can, give myself a higher score. If I can't, then give myself the appropriate score that might be lower than that, and then move on to the next question. Now, also, those of you who like to talk about, sermons that last too long, the sermon is in your hands now, okay? So if today's sermon goes too long, you can't blame me. I just gave a very quick introduction here. You're going to do this, and then I'll check with you every few minutes and see if I feel like we're doing it. Now, one more disclaimer, and that's this. You do not have to show this to anybody else. You don't have to turn it into me. I'm not going to see your scores unless you just want me to. I'll give you a little encouragement at the end if you want to show maybe a family member or a best friend or someone in a mentoring group just to see if you're self-assessing correctly. You can show it to them. But I'm going to ask you now just to take a few moments, fill this out, don't overthink it, move through it, and then we'll come right back after it looks like most everybody's finished, and I'll conclude your sermon. Just raise your hand if you're not finished yet. All right, we'll give it a few more minutes. All right, raise your hand if you're still not finished. Now we know who our overthinkers are, okay? I'm kidding. All right, so as the last few people are finishing up, we'll go ahead and move down to the where do I go from here? If you're really, really brave, you put your name on it. We did a similar kind of assessment when this church was in pre-launch stage. Some of you who were here then may remember doing something very similar to this then. And somebody accidentally left theirs, when they left the worship service, they left their paper there, and I ended up picking it up. So I got a really good insight into the person, what they were doing. So if you don't want anybody to know, be sure and fold it up and take it with you when you go. But what I hope you'll do, first of all, is pray over this assessment and discern which of the above areas you feel like you need to grow in right now. And you're like, well, I got a lot of checks on the left side. I got a lot of places to grow. I'm not quite sure where to start. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. If you're married, why don't you share this with your spouse? This would be my encouragement to you, or your mentoring group, and ask them to validate its accuracy as they see it. Because a self-assessment is only as good as our self-assessing, right? And we all have blind spots, and we all have some things. I did a similar exercise to this one time, and I showed it to Noelle, and she got a red pen out and showed me where I was wrong, okay? And then but it actually made for some good discussion. I'm like, well, why do I think I'm a 4 here, and you think I'm a 2? And then she was happy to supply me with examples, illustrations, day-to-day life things that just, bring to my attention, that kind of thing. And that's one of the beautiful things about a good marriage, is that we want to grow and we want to help the other person grow, and we can be open to constructive feedback. So if you do this with your spouse, be gentle with each other. Don't be afraid to give an example or say, I think this is a pattern, or we've never even looked at doing anything like this before, and I don't think I've ever seen you attempt this before. And so, but do it in a loving, gentle way, because that's how it's best received. Next, do you believe that God is motivating your desire to make changes in these areas? And why do you feel this way? It's not just enough to say, gave myself a 1 or a 2 here. Okay, next. It's easy to gloss over the things that we don't want to have to deal with about ourselves. But as we do that, it does stretch us, and it gives God room to show us His grace. We talk about God stretching us a lot of time, but in the middle of the stretch, He gives us grace. He helps us to grow. And grace, the Bible says grace is not just undeserved forgiveness. The Bible actually says that grace teaches us. Grace is a teacher. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness. Wow. And a lot of times I don't think of grace as a teacher. I think of it as a rescue. I think of it as something I'm extremely grateful for. And wow, I can't believe God, you're that good to me. But grace is also a teacher. And when God gives you grace in areas that you haven't grown as much as maybe you could have or should have by this point, God's grace will give you opportunity. God's grace will teach you. So let God's grace teach you. Number 4, map out a personal growth plan for these areas of your life. Now, there's a reason I intentionally did not do this lesson around New Year's Eve, because I know how New Year's resolutions go, right? Within a week, most of them are broken. Within a month, most of them are forgotten about, right? But if we're in the habit of continually self-assessing, We don't need a special holiday to set a goal for our lives. One of the best qualities I think a mature disciple has is this. Every day as I go, I'm checking my motives. Every day I'm looking at my behavior, not just from my perspective, but from God's perspective. And I also want to see how other people are seeing my behavior, how other people are seeing my attitude, how other people are hearing my words. And if we make this an ongoing part of our thought process every day, guess what? Our mistakes get fewer and fewer, and our growth gets stronger and stronger. And who of us doesn't need to continually self-assess? So once we've self-assessed, let's make a personal growth plan, and that ought to include something written down on paper, but also something that becomes a new habit, if you don't already have it, of asking yourself constantly, where am I right now? What is my next step? What am I doing? How can I grow from here? You know, God gives us every week in this church, we get the opportunity to self-assess. You know, one of the things we're supposed to do when you partake of the Lord's Supper, Paul told the Corinthians, he said, let a man examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the wine. Why? Why would that be a time of reflection? Because as we remember what Jesus did for us when he went to the cross and he paid the price for our sin, it makes me reflective on my sin and my sin nature and what, you know, am I crucifying this daily? Am I just letting it go? Am I not even thinking about it at all? And there's something about the nature of a quiet, meditative moment when we partake of the Lord's Supper to ask ourselves, how'd you do this week? Where did your attitude get out of line? Where were your words not generous to other people? Where was my example not reflecting Christ in the way it should have, that might have hurt another person's view of how they see me as a Christian? And if we do that just once a week, imagine how much better the following week would go every time we did it. And that's one of the reasons we do partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday in this church. I believe there was a kind of a precedent in the New Testament. Acts 20 verse 7 says, on the first day of the week, they gather together to break bread. Right? And so, but also, I need it. I need it every week. I need that kind of assessment in my life constantly. And more than even just once a week, I need it all the time. I need it constantly. So I've tried in my lifetime, I've tried to develop a mindset that as I go, I am aware of my example. I'm aware of how God perceives me. I'm aware of how people perceive me. And I'm trying to be aware of how I perceive myself so that all of those kind of come into reality. All right, so number 5, share this in your mentoring relationship. If you have someone that you get with regularly, I know a lot of you do, and I hope more of you will as we continue to grow in that area. And let them help you come up with a customized growth plan. You know, one of the things I do in a lot of my mentoring relationships is we'll just stop and ask, you know, how are you doing? What's God working in your heart? What do you think God's trying to teach you right now? And then find a way to support that person in that. So do that, and sometimes it looks like coming up with a customized growth plan. And you're like, well, I got so many 1s and 2s on here, I don't know where to start. Well, I have an answer for that. You start at the top. Because the upward is the most important of all these. Your relationship with God is more important than anything else in this world. And anything that's a habit that takes you away from that is a habit that needs to be changed. Anything that's a habit that drives you more into that is a habit that needs to be encouraged and facilitated and grow in. And so maybe you want to set a threshold. Maybe your threshold is 3 or 4 or whatever your threshold is, and say everything below this number, I'm going to start at the top and work on that. And maybe one of those first numbers is in that first section, in that upward section that's designated by the gold heading. If you want to work on those for a while, and then go down to the green, the inward, and then the blue, the outward, and then look at how you're managing your life. What I find on mine personally is some things are pretty high on the upward, inward, and outward, but then when it gets to the life management part, I've got some lower scores. So what that tells me is there's still some things I need to work on, They're probably related to one of the first three, upward, inward, or outward, but it's how they're actually coming out in my life. It's how it's manifesting in my life. So I don't want to just have it all up here. It needs to be in my schedule. It needs to be in my day. It needs to be in my behavior. And of course, it needs to be in my heart first before it can do that. So share, and then if you're not sure where to start, begin with the lowest number. If you have several that are tied for the lowest, start at the top down. And then watch God show you His grace. Watch God honor the effort you're making to be a better disciple of His. To be a person that honors Him more with your life. That honors Him more with your heart, your time, your finances, your talents, all the things, your relationships that need to be managed. And if you're not sure how to make a plan, the sixth thing down here at the bottom of the back page talks about SMART goals. This is something I learned from a coach quite a few years back that I started implementing, and I still try to implement in my personal life. And a SMART goal is basically, it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. So specific is exactly what do you want to do. You know, it can't be a vague goal because it's like, I want to be a better Christian. You know, that's not very specific, is it? It's got to be something specific. Why? Because if it's not specific, it can't do the next one, and that is measurable. Measurable. You can't measurable other than just kind of gauge in your head, I think I'm better this week than I was last week. I think I'm better this month than I was last month. Something that's measurable. So let's say you self-assessed yourself and gave yourself a score of a 1 or a 2 on I daily try to read my Bible and pray. That one that had something to do with that. What would be a measurable goal for that would be, since I'm not sure I can go from 0 to 100 all at once, I'm going to try 5 days this week of reading my Bible for at least 15 minutes and praying for at least 15 minutes. And then I'll check back a week from now, or check in with my mentor or my spouse or whoever you might be sharing this with, and let them ask you, how'd you do on that? Well, I only made 3. Well, that's 3 more than you had last week. That's good. All right, let's try for 5 again next week. So instead of beating ourselves up over these things where we're not doing as well, let's look for ways just to positively encourage them. Okay? People work a lot better and grow a lot faster in an environment of grace and acceptance than they do of guilt and condemnation. And so that's just a general rule of life. So specific, measurable, achievable. You don't want to say, I want to become a missionary in Africa full-time for the rest of my life next week. Okay? Probably not going to happen. That's probably not achievable, right? And so you want something that will stretch you, but not overwhelm you. Something that's going to encourage you if you get it done, but you're not going to be just flat out on the floor discouraged if you don't get it done. So make it achievable, something that's going to stretch you, but actually could be done if you put some time and effort into it. Next would be relevant. Does this goal help you with your overall goal of discipleship, of being like Jesus? Would it really help you grow if you change this? And I think sometimes some of these things on here we'll look at and we'll kind of devalue. We'll say, well, this one's not that important, or that's not my gift, or that's not my thing, or I'm no good at that. So we just write it off. Everything on here is relevant. Every state has been carefully gone over and looked at, and it will help you grow. It will help you grow. And then finally, timely. If we don't have a deadline for when it's going to happen, I don't know if you're like me, but like me, I can have 20 things on my to-do list. But the ones I'm going to start with are going to be the ones that have the nearest deadline. And that can be good and bad, okay? Because there are some things that just don't have deadlines, but you need to do them anyway. So the battle then becomes, am I ever going to get to the really important stuff, or am I going to let the urgent stuff get in the way? We do need a balance of both. But as far as timely goes, give yourself not only an achievable goal, but one that is achievable within a certain amount of time. And if it's one of those things where you need to step up, I'm going to read my Bible 3 days this week, 5 days the next week, 6 days the next week, 7 days the next week, that kind of thing, then just make it timely. Set an achievable goal in an amount of time, and depending on how big the goal is or how much we need to break it into, each one you should be able to notice difference in a week. That's kind of a good idea of time, how long it would take you to do that. Okay? So, if you don't want anybody else to see it, this is now a good time to fold up your sheets. Okay? And this is also a good time to decide, who am I going to share this with? Preferably a spouse or a mentor or a best friend or someone who knows you really, really well. And of course, you don't really know someone really, really well unless you live with them. So if you got somebody that lives with you, that's a good person to share with. If you don't, then a best friend, someone you spend a lot of time with that knows you well and you can trust and is looking out for your best interest. Don't show this to somebody that's going to rake you over the coals for this, okay? Someone who's looking out for your best interest. All right, so you did a great job on the sermon today. Thank you. I appreciate every one of you for all the input that you put down on your sheet of paper. And as promised, we're going to get out a little early today, so we're going to have the band come on up. I do want to pray over this, and then we're going to sing this last song, Lord, I Need You, and that will dismiss us. God, thank you so much for the example of Jesus. Thank you so much for guiding us and leading us with your Spirit. Thank you for being the kind of God that gives us an intellect. And I pray that you take our blind spots and you open them up to us. And I pray that you use our closest relationships, those people we trust and love, and they trust and love us, to share and to encourage and to help stretch and to pray for, so that we can become increasingly more of what you intended us to be. Jesus, we want to be like you in our character, in our words, in our behavior, in our attitude, in our ministry, in our service, in every way that we can. We want to be like you, Jesus, because we know that you're perfect. And we're striving for that, and we know when we self-assess how far away we are from that, but we know your grace is sufficient. And so, God, I pray that you would let us rest in your grace, but be stretched at the same time into what you want for us. We pray this in Jesus' name.